Hello there, everybody, and welcome back to Buckeye Politics. It's me, your favorite Ohioan. So today we're going to be discussing the unthinkable flips of the 2022 Senate elections. If you're a big fan of Let's Talk Elections or Ready Go Politics, they did videos similar to this going into the 2020 presidential election, where they talked about the unthinkable flips for the 2020 election. If you look, and LTE's video especially caught my eye because he actually listed Georgia in I think it was July as a state that could possibly flip. He saw something with the voter trends, the increased growth in Atlanta, and it's narrowing in recent years, demographics, all that good stuff. He did a little bit of research, and he and he said that Georgia could possibly flip. Was it likely? No, but there was something there it could show it could flip, and everyone called him crazy. They said, nah, Georgia's not going to flip, and me included. I also did not expect Georgia to flip. I had Georgia going to Trump by like 3 to 4 points, and here we are. Georgia flipped to Joe Biden. So it's interesting to see how a few months out, we could say a race is completely not going to be competitive. It's not even going to be close. And then, there might be something there that says it could be competitive that we kind of ignore, or we just say, oh, it's an outlier. And it ends up really, being important. And then the state actually does flip. So after looking at all that, in terms of LTE's video on the state of Georgia, and I believe we talked about Texas. That really didn't come to fruition, but especially Georgia. I think that was an interesting video that he made it in July, August. He said it was unthinkable. It was never going to happen. But he did have some support. He said, "Oh, it's narrowing. There's a lot of growth in the Atlanta area, so it could flip." No one really believed him except the far left people who sent for him, and yet the state of Georgia did flip because of all the things he said. Did it seem likely back when he talked about it? No, everyone thought Georgia was going to go to Trump, but it ended up going to Joe Biden, and those things he talked about back then really did happen, and they really did come in clutch for the Democrats. So it's interesting to see how much elections can change just by how much closer we get to the election, and how some stuff that may seem very unimportant go a while before the election takes place could actually happen then. So we're going to do a video similar to that, but we're going to be discussing the 2022 midterm elections. This is going to be the video focused on the Senate. I will do a governorship one probably next week at some point after the unthinkable flips of the governor election. So as you can see here, this is my current Senate prediction. Republicans get 53 seats, the Democrats 47. I'm not gonna make a video until February about my why I think each state's gonna vote which way. An actual Senate prediction. You're just gonna kind of get a glimpse of it now. But with that, we're gonna get into the video. We're gonna do three states that most people consider safe Republican, and three states most people consider safe Democratic. And we're gonna see, could they possibly flip? Could they be the Georgia of the 2022 Senate elections, or the Virginia, I guess, of the 2021 governorship elections? Because back a year ago, nobody thought Virginia would flip. People had it likely to save D. They don't manage to pull it off because of last few months of the stretch campaigning. And if you look back, there was kind of something there, a national environment, all that good stuff. So yeah, we're going to take a look at some elections and Senate elections, and we'll see, could they possibly flip? So the first state we're going to look at is actually the state of Indiana. In 2016, Republican Senator Todd Young only won the state of Indiana by 9.7 points over his Democratic challenger Evan Bath. Yes, a Libertarian nominee, Lucy Brenton, did spoil the election, getting 5.5% of the vote. Well, she didn't spoil it, but she made it much closer than it probably should have been. But even if you give 5.5%, that 5.5% of the vote to Todd Young, he still underperforms Trump by 5 points. And in our timeline, what ended up happening is in 2016, Todd Young underperformed Trump by 10 points. So yeah, Indiana is a state that went to Trump by 19 in 2016. Todd Young went up by 9.7. Even if he gets all the libertarian votes, he still only wins in the state of Indiana by about 15 points, and still underperforms Trump by 5. Now Todd Young is running for re-election, obviously in 2022. And although most people do not have the state being all that competitive, but who knows? I mean, everyone has the safe R. Todd Young, he's pretty well liked in the state of Indiana. Most people have the race as safe R. So I seriously doubt it's going to flip. But you do have to admit that in 2016, the race was much closer than most people expected. And if the Democrats get a good candidate up, and they can and they may be able to do something, maybe Todd Young makes a slip up. Who knows? We could possibly see Indiana flip. Is it likely? No. But you do have to admit that Todd Young is not all that. Well, he didn't run for election in 2010. But you do have to admit that Todd Young only won by 9.7 points, while Trump won the state by 19 points. Is a little suspicious, I guess. It could tell something about the 2022 Senate elections. Is it likely? No. Is it possible? Yes. So we're going to put the state of Indiana. Let's say they pick up Indiana. Is it likely? No, absolutely not. I seriously doubt the Democrats are going to get Indiana within 15. But who knows? They pick it up. The next state we're going to look at is actually the state of Missouri. And now a lot of people on the left are going to say this isn't an unthinkable flip. Missouri's going to flip. The Missouri is a swing state still, and because my man Roy Blunt over here only won by like 2 points. But Roy Blunt is also a very establishmentarian Republican. He really is not all that well liked. He's pretty anti-Trump, and he's also retiring after this year. A lot of this stuff that's happening, a lot of the reason that Missouri was close in 2016 was because Roy Blunt was not a big fan of Trump, and he was very much establishmentarian. And Missouri is a pretty populous state. I mean, Obama almost won it in 2008. Trump really made Missouri very Republican. Yeah, Missouri was always trending Republican, but Trump just accelerated those trends in the rural areas, especially. And so Missouri is a state that, yes, it was competitive in 2016, but I doubt it's going to flip in 2022. But that said, you have to admit that it was pretty close. And if the Democrats get a good nominee, maybe the Republican nominee isn't all that great. They're more of a Roy Blunt fan instead of a Josh Hawley kind of guy. Then Missouri could possibly flip, could possibly be much more closer than it was in the past. Now, an interesting thing to note is that yes, Roy Blunt only won Missouri by 2.8 points. But if you go back to 2010, in a year that many people are saying 2022 will be similar to. I mean, most people say 2022 and 2010 both are probably going to be massive red wave years. As you can see, Roy Blunt won by 13 points. So, I mean, I guess it's possible that he could win. I mean, I guess it's possible Missouri could get closer. That's Josh Hawley's race. I mean, yeah, even in 2018, Josh Hawley only won by 5.8. So Missouri on the Senate level is still pretty competitive, I guess. 2010 was kind of an outlier, but because 2010 was such a Republican wave year, and 2022 is expected to be very similar, I do think that the Republicans should have no issue hanging on to the state of Missouri. So with that, we are now going to head to the last Republican state that could possibly flip, and that's the state of Alaska. Got to fill in the state of Missouri. The Democrats get a good nominee. The Republican nominee is just a Roy Blunt simp. He hates Josh Hawley, calls out Trump. He runs a bad campaign. Democrats get a populist, traditional Southern Democrat type. Democrats pick up the state of Missouri. Now we're going to look at the state of Alaska. And that is Lisa Murkowski is obviously facing a primary challenge from the likes of Kelly Tshibaka. And although Murkowski has been pretty much immune to primary challenges, as we've seen in the 2010 primary election. I mean, this is 2010 Senate election in which she actually lost the Republican primary, but she ran a writing campaign and managed to defeat Joe Miller. So we could see a scenario similar to this, but because Alaska has taken a slightly leftward trend mostly because of white people not liking Trump and young white liberals moving into the Juneau and moving into Alaska, so like the scenery and all that good stuff, we could possibly see Alaska get more competitive. I think the worst case scenario in this election is Kelly Tshibaka wins the Republican nomination, and Lisa Murkowski runs a writing campaign similar to 2010, and the Republican vote, similar to the 1912 general election, gets split in half, and the Democrats actually manage to win. Now, the only thing that I think will prevent this from happening is ranked choice voting. Unless a lot of Republicans are really pissed at Murkowski or really pissed at Tshibaka, they're likely going to write in the other Republican as their second choice. And because of ranked choice voting, whichever Republican gets the most ranked choice votes, I do believe that they will manage to defeat the Democrat, because I seriously doubt a lot of people voting for Murkowski or voting for Tshibaka are going to write in the Democrat nominee before another Republican. Is it possible for some really hardcore Trump supporters to do that? Yes. Is it possible for some really hardcore Murkowski supporters to do that? Yes. But I doubt it's going to be more than 5-10% of the people who elect them. The vast majority are going to just say, we want a Republican, we just want this type of Republican, but as long as it's a Republican, we're okay with that. So, and yeah, what a lot of election YouTubers don't realize is the vast majority of people could really care less about who exactly their nominee is. I mean, as long as most people are going to say, I want a Republican, I want a conservative. If it's Murkowski, meh. If it's Tshibaka, great. But I'd much rather have a Republican who's going to vote with me and vote with my values, at least the majority of the time, than a Democrat who's going to vote with me and my values pretty much never. So that's why I do not think Alaska's going to flip, because a lot of people are just going to write in the other Republican, and the other Republican who gets the most secondary votes is going to end up defeating the Democrat. But, in a worst-case scenario, and let's say they really despise each other, the Democrat can end up winning because of Republican vote splitting. In my opinion, I think Murkowski's gonna lose the primary, and I think Tshibaka's gonna win by a likely safe margin. I don't think Murkowski's gonna run a writing campaign if she loses If Murkowski loses, I doubt she's going to run a write-in campaign. I mean, she seems pretty much tired and done with everything. She's had a good run. I don't think she has. I don't think she really cares enough anymore. She's never really cared about Alaska to begin with. She's just a daddy's girl who runs on my dad was such a good governor. Vote for me. And I mean, it's worked for her. It's worked for her. I'll give her that. And she is a very talented politician, as we've seen in 2010, managing to win a write-in campaign and on a statewide level. So it's impressive. I'll give her that. But not a big fan of Lisa Murkowski. And I think if she's smart, she's gonna retire. If she's smart, if she loses the primary, she's gonna retire and say, you know what, my time in politics is over. Sorry for that little rant there. We're gonna now fill in the state of Alaska. Democrats put up a good candidate. Republicans split the vote between Murkowski and Shibaka, and Alaska flips Democratic very narrowly. We now have a 50-50 split. Could you imagine if this was the map? Republicans pick up Nevada, but they lose in Alaska, Missouri, and Indiana. But don't worry, folks, this map is about to get a lot more cursed, as we're going to go into the possible states that Republicans could pick up from the Democrats. And the first state is actually the state of Washington. And the state of Washington is pretty interesting, in my opinion. We're actually staying in 2010, and we're going to go to the 2010 election in the state of Washington. And this was between Democrat Patty Murray and Republican Dino Rossi. So, and yes, Washington flipping Republican is a long shot, but there is some evidence to support that it could be closer than it has been in recent years. As we can see in 2010, a year many experts are saying 2022 could end up being similar to in terms of being a red wave year. Incumbent Washington Senator Patty Murray only won by 4 points against Republican I'm assuming it's Dino. It's a pretty epic name, Dino Rossi. So if it's Dino, I don't really care. I think Dino Rossi is a pretty epic name, so I'm gonna call him that. But yeah, so Patty Murray was actually very competitive in 2010, a year that many people are saying 2022 could be similar to. But that's if we go to 2016. Patty Murray won by like 18 points. It was a complete landslide against Chris Vance. But I think that 2016 is a bit of an outlier because in 2016, the entire state of Washington took a pretty leftward trend. It turned out Seattle had a massive population boom and became a lot more progressive, a lot more democratic in 2016. A lot of Hillary supporters voted for Patty Murray. And if you look at the Republican, this Republican was absolutely awful. He underperformed Trump pretty heavily in the state of Washington. And so, yes, as you can see, Patty Murray did win by a massive margin in 2016. But the entire state of Washington showed a pretty big trend to the left in 2016. And Murray was pretty popular. And her Republican challenger, Chris Vance, he was an absolute rhino. He was a never-Trumper, and he was a rhino. And he did absolutely awful in the rural areas. Let's compare his 2016 election. Look at the rural parts of Washington compared to 2010. They were a lot more Republican. Chris Vance did absolutely awful in rural Washington. People did not like him because they like Trump. A lot of rural Washington is similar to Idaho, Montana. They're big Trump fans. They're not going to vote for a toothless Republican like Chris Vance. Not going to turn out. So 2016, I think, is pretty telling because if you look at it, Patty Murray, she won by 18 points, but she ran against a toothless Republican in a year Washington trended pretty democratic. And in 2010, when she ran against a pretty solid Republican, from what I've read about him, he's not great, but he's pretty good, and it's very much a Republican rave year. She only won by 4 points, so it could be interesting. So we're going to come back to 2022 now. And 2022 is very interesting to look at, because if we look at some polling for the 2022 election, it actually is getting much closer. If we look at public policy polling, a Democrat internal, by a pretty progressive pollster in all things considered, it's literally the Northwest Progressive Institute. It shows that Patty Murray is winning by 50% of the vote to the most likely Republican nominee in terms of Smiley, 37% of the vote. These people have some awesome names in Washington. Dino, Smiley. I don't know, I'm just saying. But anyway, going back to 2022, so there was a poll that came out recently that showed Patty Murray only winning by like 3 points against a generic Republican, which is awful news. And if you look at this, RCP, which in the end is a pretty Republican-leaning pollster, has moved the race down to likely D. So that could be very good news for the Republicans, as does appear to be some pollster evidence showing that Patty Murray is struggling a little bit. And if we look at public policy polling, which is a very left-leaning and progressive polling institute, as it says polls in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, Patty Murray maintains a double-digit lead. But if you look closer, it has actually gotten much closer. Patty Murray at one point had a 16-point lead last spring. It's now down to 13 points. So even some progressive pollsters do show Washington getting slightly more competitive, and the not sure voters has also increased. So it's interesting to see how Murray has how the race has gotten at least 3 points closer. Our Republican-leaning pollster has the state as only being likely D, while Progressive Institute is saying, yeah, it's getting a lot closer. Now, I seriously doubt it's going to flip, but never, who knows. And the other thing to look at is according to this pollster, they had Patty Murray up 16 points a year ago. Then I have her up 13, and she only barely reached 50%. 13% of the likely voters are unsure, and there are a lot more undecided voters now than there were last year when they last did this poll. So I seriously doubt this race is going to flip, but it's interesting to note that Patty Murray is only getting 50% of the vote. Meanwhile, a lot more voters are unsure than they were last year at this time, and some Republican, and it's not just Republican-leaning pollsters that have the races likely D. Even some Democrat-leaning pollsters, as we see in public policy polling, have the race getting a little bit closer. And you can see that the Republicans are in a bit of an upward trend. Now, I doubt Washington is going to flip, but we have to admit that some of the recent polling out of the state does possibly show that it could flip. I believe there was actually a poll done by Elway Research that only shows, I mentioned earlier, that only shows Patty Murray up by a generic Republican by 3 points. So yeah, like I said, the poll is an outlier and has a right-leaning bias, as we saw in public policy polling, pretty much a Democrat internal. It's really a It's not the only poll saying that's not really an outlier. This race is getting getting closer. I mean, is it going to flip? Probably not, but it is possible. I mean, it's definitely much more competitive than it was a year ago. So with that, let's say Patty Murray loses to a Republican. Republicans flip the state of Washington. Now, the next state we're going to look at is actually the state of Maryland. Now, Maryland is a pretty interesting state to look at. Larry Hogan this race literally comes down to one factor only, and that only factor is if Larry Hogan runs in the state of Maryland. Now, Larry Hogan, as of now, I don't think Larry Hogan would be able to flip the state of Maryland, but it is interesting to look at how the Democrat, how close this race could possibly be. So if Larry Hogan does enter the race, which he has expressed interest in, it's not like this is just something that's made up by people on election Twitter. Larry Hogan has done interviews where he said, you know what, I would not mind running in the Senate race. I'd like to challenge Chris Van Hollen. So as of now, I'd say it's about a 50-50 chance on whether or not Hogan enters the race. He's definitely alluded to the fact that he wants to run, but that said, he has not yet announced, and it is getting pretty close to the primary. We still have a few months, but the vast majority of people have announced by now. So I kind of doubt that Larry Hogan is going to run at this point. But he has expressed interest, so we may never know. We're eventually going to find out, obviously, but there is still a chance Hogan could run and make this one state Democratic race pretty competitive, in my opinion. So if Larry Hogan entered the race, I'd honestly move Maryland to the lean D column, as Larry Hogan has a pretty good approval rating. He has a 90% approval rating with blacks, and a 70% approval rating with white people with a college degree, which is very good for a state like Maryland. And so we don't have a lot of polls to go, and it's not just Hogan's approval rating. There are actually plenty of polls that could say this race could get closer. If we look at this race here, if we look at polls done, this one just done in January of 2022, a very recent poll. Larry Hogan is defeating Chris Van Hollen 49-37 with 14% undecided. Now, yes, this poll was done by a Republican internal. Larry Hogan's campaign did partially fund the poll. If we look at a Democrat internal, by Change Research, we have a 50-34% lead for Chris Van Hollen over Larry Hogan. So, obviously, we don't have any true nonpartisan polling to go off of, but off of these several internals show a very interesting trend. So, obviously, Larry Hogan's campaign partially paid for this poll to be done, but in the end, it shows Hogan defeating Van Hollen 49-37. Now, this is an internal, but it shows that Hogan is relatively popular and that people wouldn't mind seeing him run for the Senate. And the other thing that's interesting is that these polls are basically identical. Not basically identical. They're very close. I mean, they're only a few points off. Hogan wins 49-37. Van Hollen wins 50-34. And so the interesting thing to note is that Chris Van Hollen against Larry Hogan, even in Democrat internal, he only gets 50% of the vote. And there's still a lot of undecided voters out there. A lot of people would make last minute decisions on who they're going to vote for in a red wave year when Larry Hogan is relatively popular. Who knows? We could possibly see this state become a Republican pickup. Is it likely? No, but I mean it's always possible. And the other thing to note is that in a state like Maryland, it's such a Democratic-leaning state. You would think that a poll done by Larry Hogan's campaign, even a Republican internal, would only have him up by a few points. Meanwhile, a poll done by a Democratic internal would show an absolute landslide. But no, Larry Hogan is actually beating Chris Van Hollen by a decent margin, even in his own internals, and they're pretty similar to a Democrat internal. So in a Democrat internal, in a Democratic-leaning state, you expect a Republican internal to at least, I'm probably sure the Republican doing well, but not as well as the Democrat. So this is an interesting race to note. And if you balance out the two polls, let's just say, since they're pretty much identical, if you balance out the two polls, Chris Van Hollen only has a couple point lead over Larry Hogan. It's like, what, 45, 42? Probably that's probably way off. But Chris Van Hollen is only up by a few points if you kind of balance out the polls between the Republican bias showing Hogan up by 11 or 12, excuse me, and the Democrat bias showing Hollen up by 16. So if you can, with a lot of undecided voters in a Republican wave year, we could possibly see this race flip Republican if people just decide, you know what, I kind of like Larry Hogan. He's a pretty good governor. I mean, polls show people like Hogan, and you know what, Biden's not. I'm not happy with Joe Biden. We could possibly, if Larry Hogan enters the race, runs a good campaign, we could possibly see the state flip. And I mean, polls already show this race could be pretty close. And as we saw in the only really truly unbiased poll, yes, it was done 2 years ago. A lot has changed since then. Hogan is defeating Van Hollen. Just saying. It's interesting to note how competitive this race could become if Hogan enters. So the final state we're going to look at is this state is, in my opinion, the biggest long shot, and that is the state of Connecticut. Now, Connecticut on the Senate level is really not that close, and this is going to be a pretty quick video. In 2016, Richard Blumenthal won an absolute landslide over Dan Carter, who is the Republican. I seriously doubt this race is going to flip, in all honesty. There's really only one scenario I see it getting very close, and that is if the Republican nominee for governor, Bob Stefankowski, who made this race very close against Democrat. We're looking at the gubernatorial results now. Bob Stefankowski made the 2018 gubernatorial election very close against Ned Lamont. So I could possibly see this. So the only scenario I see Connecticut getting closer is just kind of scenario I made in my head, but it is possible. Bob Stefankowski gets the Republican nomination. He runs a very good campaign. He runs on anti-Biden sentiment and yes, Ned Lamont has gotten a lot more popular. But Bob Stefankowski, he runs a campaign similar to 2018. And 2018 was a massive blue wave year, and Ned Lamont only won by 3 points. So let's say even though it's a Republican wave year, but Ned Lamont is popular, that should balance things out to make a similar environment to 2018. Bob Stefankowski gets the Republican nomination. He runs a very good campaign against Ned Lamont. Runs an anti-Biden sentiment, anti-Ned Lamont. I mean, he just runs a good campaign, and sort of, that a Glenn Youngkin style campaign, focusing on kitchen table issues. Ned Lamont gets a little bit challenged, a little bit whatever. The race in Connecticut gets much closer, and because of that, we see a Republican like Dan Carter, similar to 2010. I mean, the 2010 race was pretty close between Richard Blumenthal and the Republican Linda McMahon. Richard Blumenthal won by 12 points. And Connecticut was much closer than it usually is in 2010, and that 2010 is a year people are comparing 2022 to. So yeah, Connecticut and the gubernatorial election gets very close. Republicans turn out heavily. Bob Stefankowski manages to somehow flip the Connecticut gubernatorial election. Those same people turn out in a Republican wave year, similar to 2010. We managed to possibly flip Connecticut, or at least make it much closer, because of people turn out for Stefankowski. We get a good Republican nominee who runs with him. Anti-Biden sentiment. We flip Connecticut red. It's very unlikely, but I mean, I guess it's possible. So yeah, I seriously doubt Connecticut's gonna flip. Let's go back to the Senate. Richard Blumenthal is very popular, and I doubt it's gonna flip. But in a good year where we get solid Republican turnout, in a wave year similar to 2010, where the governor's race is already very competitive, we could see a lot of Republicans turn out and support vote Republican down ballot and make the Connecticut Senate race flip Republican. So this is my unlikely flips, but I guess technically possible. Some of these are a pretty big long shot, but I also put it's mostly because I wanted to balance out the results between Republicans and Democrats. I didn't want to do all Republicans or all Democrats. So yeah, a lot of this is a little scuffed, a little cursed. A lot of these are long. Some of these are pretty big long shot with not a lot of evidence to back it up. But like I said, just wanted to make a little video about it could possibly flip on the Senate or gubernatorial level. Thank you for watching. And speaking of the Maryland race, NTEP, I'll leave the link to his channel in the pinned comment. He's making a full-on video and an in-depth analysis on the state of Maryland. So please watch that. Please support him if you want to learn about how Maryland could possibly be much closer. So thank you for watching this video. I know it's a long one. I know it's a little dragged on. But yeah, I think it's an interesting video to talk about states that could possibly flip. But, very unlikely, but could possibly flip. So if you want to see more videos like this, please be sure to like and subscribe.